You are watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brannon High.
And welcome to the broadcast on this May 13th, I guess it is. I can't find my phone. May 13th, 2025, the Washington Report, the Worldview 2 Washington Report, brought to you in part by you as you support us through the foundation, worldviewfoundation.com, worldviewfoundation.com. Joining me is my co-host each and every night of the conservativecaucus.org, theconservativecaucus.org, Jim Paff. Jim, welcome to the broadcast. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be with you, Brandon, as always.
Well, we're getting news as we're coming on the air tonight. The Trump administration, along with the U.S. government have officially taken control of New York's Rikers Island State Prison in Bronx, New York. What do you make of this tonight, Jim?
I'm just getting the news now. Very interesting. I don't know what the purpose of it is yet, so I'm a little lost there. But I will say this. We still have in our major cities a very real problem of crime that Democrat politicians, by and large, are unwilling to do anything about. They're allowing criminal behavior to run rampant. We see Democrats, as happened with the New Jersey ICE facility the other day, going to defend the rights of clear violent criminals, as opposed to really a peaceable culture. It really is spiritually evil what's going on. So I'm getting the news as you are, so we'll see what it all means. But you know, this is the Trump administration is taking seriously what has needed to be taken serious for a long period of time, and here we go. We'll find out more as time goes on, obviously.
What do you make of President Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia today? It's a big. We're going to talk about it a lot on Brian House Live tonight. We've already talked about it for an hour on Worldview Radio, which also is a TV show. But what are your thoughts on this trip?
Listen, Donald Trump rightly is resetting the international agenda. He's spending his time taking out of the milieu of U.S. relations in foreign nations the need to obey us, which has always been under the threat of war. You know, we've been doing nation building around the world for a long time, as Trump pointed out today, highly unsuccessfully. And he was right there praising a Middle Eastern country for doing what it ought to do to be useful in the international stage. And interestingly, you know, there are some problems with Saudi Arabia. This is not some perfect country. You had the Khashoggi murder a few years ago is still a little bit of a question. And there are implications that came from the Saudi royal family in some way or another. You also have the information that former Congressman Kurt Weldon was talking about in various podcasts recently about Saudi intervention to help the 9/11 hijackers. And of course, that was quite a while back from now. Obviously, that's more than 20 years ago. So there's a few clouds there. But what you're seeing Saudi Arabia do with the implementation of its sovereign wealth fund is attempting to not only change their reliance upon oil long term and try to build an economy that is allowing for innovation and in technology in particular and other areas, And you're seeing a liberalization of their culture as well. Women are allowed to drive. They weren't allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia forever. They have more freedoms than they've ever had. And yet they're doing this more inspired by what can work in Western cultures, particularly the United States, but done seemingly in a heartfelt manner. Every nation has its evil in it at some place or another. As I always say, 6,000 years of recorded human history proves the radical corruption of mankind. Every nation has its failings and faults. What we have been uniquely successful doing in the United States initially is building a culture that was quickly growing in its already solid moral foundation, eschewing issues like slavery and a couple other things. And we're walking towards a perfection based on the rule of law and a moral culture. This has inspired countries around the world. And even though our failings now, in my estimation, are much greater than they were at our founding as it relates to slavery, which was a horrible evil, of course. But even with all that, countries are inspired by what we've been able to do. So Donald Trump recognizes that. He spoke of peace and seeking peace with nations, and he doesn't do so without seeking some moral component of understanding what peace should be. We've had many who have sought peace and there's no moral component to it, just peace at all costs. Donald Trump doesn't have that stand. But he does seek peace with a strong American nation. And this is something radically different than both Republican and Democrat leaders in this nation have been doing since the Cold War.
Absolutely. Here's a letter several members of Congress have sent to Mike Johnson, basically telling him, get your rear in gear, buddy. Dear Speaker Johnson, on January 2025, President Trump returned to office and immediately went to work ushering in a new golden age for the United States. In pursuit of this mission, he has signed numerous executive orders to rein in spending, shrink bloated bureaucracies in the culture war launched by the left, and restore accountability to Washington. But let's be clear, unless Congress acts, many of these victories are at risk. A future Democrat president could erase them with a stroke of a pen. We cannot let that happen. If we want this new era of American greatness to last, we must codify the president's actions into law. We appreciate your leadership in restoring fiscal sanity with the 119th Congress advancing a significant reconciliation package at record pace. The same urgency must now be applied to securing the president's legacy and the legacy of this Congress. House Republicans have already introduced numerous bills to enshrine the Trump agenda. From securing the border to reining in the excesses of administrative state, we urge you to make this legislation a top priority. If there's anything we can do to move this forward, we stand ready. The American people sent us here to deliver lasting change, not temporary relief. It is Congress's duty to work hand in hand with President Trump to ensure the agenda the American people elected this president and this Congress to enact, because the law of the land, or becomes the law of the land. Now is the time to act. Member of Congress Andy Ogles, Keith Self. Who else do we got here? Let's see. We've got Mark Harris, Scott Penny, Clay Higgins, Barry Moore, Mary Miller, Eli Crane, Brandon Gill, Ralph Norman, Marilyn Stutzman, Eric Burleson, Randy Weber, Michael Cloud, Ben Klein, Tim Burchett, Paul Godzer. You know what's really interesting is there's 435 of those representatives. And maybe you're more aware of who some of them are because of your working as a chief of staff on Capitol Hill, and maybe you follow D.C. Congress a little bit closer than I do. Obviously, I know who Clay Higgins is. I know who Eli Crane is. I know who Eric Burleson is. I know who Tim Burchett is. I know who Paul Godzer is. But it's amazing the number of people in there. I don't know who they are. And Logan and I were talking about that last week. There's 435 of them, and some of them were walking by us consistently last week. And Logan's like, who is that? I'm like, I have no idea. You only know the Tim Burchett, the Chip Roys, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Glenn Grothmans, the ones that do a lot of media, conservative media, and really are out there, some of them are just so boring and vanilla. You don't even know who they are, much less what they look like. What are your thoughts?
This is a significantly good group of members of Congress. These are people who have been pushing for more cuts and a better approach to things than what leadership has wanted to do. Chip Roy's been out there talking, and we were fellow chiefs of staff together when he was chief of staff for Ted Cruz. I was for Tim Huelskamp at the time. We became friends, as you know, and we had
you got us an interview last week, and we dropped your name to him.
And he's been talking about the fact that, as is, the reconciliation bill will still add $20 trillion over the next 10 years in the projections. Now, the 10-year projections are hard to put together in a sense because the next Congress does whatever they want to do based upon whatever they want to do. They're not bound by the previous Congresses. But the fact is that the heart of this letter is exactly what Mike Johnson needs to hear. Remember, we are still living with the legislation that appropriated money above the 2019 levels, almost all of which is COVID spending. There's some extra spending that is not related to COVID, but most of it is to the tune of about $3 trillion or more dollars, all of which should be rescinded immediately because there's no need for it. We are so far past the COVID disaster, which has a lot of questions to it to begin with. Why did we go in 2020 with almost zero flu deaths, normal flu deaths? That's odd. So there are a lot of weirdness related to COVID. But if we just, take it at face value, it was a disaster. That disaster's past us. Every bit of the legislation that was intended to address the COVID situation should be rescinded immediately. That's just a great place to start. If we go back to 2019 levels, adjusted for inflation, it's roughly about $5.3 trillion budget, and we're eclipsing $7 trillion already. We're getting some downturn thanks to what the Trump administration is doing, and we saw that in the recent GDP numbers. But if we do not radically transform our spending track, we are seeing a disaster coming. We're at nearly 150% of gross domestic product in our overall national debt. What that means is, and GDP numbers include all present government spending, keep in mind. So it's actually a little worse than that in terms of percentage of GDP. The real economy cannot in the long term support a debt that is this high as it exists now, much less the track to 50 trillion that this 10-year budget estimate seems to portray. Remember, by the way, the Office of Management and Budget in 2000 and 2001, the end of the Clinton administration, the beginning of the Bush administration, projected that the then $5+ trillion debt would be paid off by 2013. Never forget that number. Anyone listening, don't ever forget that. That's where we were. We were going to pay off the debt based upon what we were doing at that time. And here we are saddled with $35 trillion of debt. Mm-hmm. It's an outrage. It is a mass theft of the American people, both through massive taxes and unnecessary taxes in many cases, and the inflation of our dollar by massive money printing out of the Federal Reserve to support this debt. Yes, this letter, frankly, isn't severe enough, but it's about as severe as it needs to be to hopefully move Mike Johnson and leadership to get their act together, because we need to do that now.
100%. But let me go back to that part of what I said. There are 435 Congress members. There are ones you really recognize in the conservative movement, and then the vast majority of them, people in their district, a lot of them don't know who they are. My congressman seems like a great guy. I saw him up on the Hill. He walked by. I'd never met him in person that I know of. I stuck my hand out, said, "I'm Brandon House." To my surprise, he said, "I know who you are." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I watched some of your videos." Now, I want to have him on the show. He lives in the town right next door, so maybe we can get him here in studio. But Logan didn't know who he was. Logan couldn't have picked him out of a lineup. And I'm not criticizing him. I'm just saying maybe he doesn't care. Maybe all he cares about are, do the people in my district know who I am? What is it about some of the congressmen or women up there that they just don't seem to be known? You don't see them like a Marjorie Taylor Greene or a Chip Roy or a Tim Burchett. The other ones, you just don't ever hear from them. All right, is that because people ignore them, they don't have a big enough personality or choose not to, or they don't care? All they care about is if the people in their district know who they are. Tell me that. Or is it they're not looking maybe to go on to be governor, run for the Senate, and so again, they don't really care. They just are there to do a few years in Congress and go home. What is it?
Well, there are quite a few factors that make it different, but there are some key ones. One is kind of a basic thing. Some individuals that get elected to Congress just are not motivated to try to get on media all the time. They they may feel like they're not as good a spokesman as others could be. Various levels of communication skill and ability there. But another reason is that, and this happens particularly with the appropriators, or the cardinals as we call them, on Capitol Hill, who they don't need to be on media to press anything because they've really got the power of the purse string. And a lot of our problem in the Republican caucus is members of the Appropriations Committee. There are standouts from time to time. Currently, Andy Harris, who's a fantastic representative and is pushing back as best he can against a lot of this stuff. Cynthia Lummis, now senator from Wyoming, she was on appropriations when she was in the House. She was fantastic too, pushing back against a lot of this stuff. But sometimes they've got so much authority and influence, they don't have to make themselves known. But the more important factor, and I think the one that really, really matters, is that most members of Congress want to maintain the status quo. It's easier for them. They feel it's more secure for their reelections if they just kind of keep their head low, because they know most people don't pay attention to members of Congress or don't know them, and they're going to pull the R lever or the D lever. And they try to, make sure that they don't make waves, and because of fear, frankly. But that fear translates also into bad votes that lead to bad policy that keep us from making the kinds of changes that are absolutely necessary to right the ship of American government. I mean, we are not an American republic by and large right now. We still have a large administrative state that is still a challenge, although he's been pretty effective at it. It's still a challenge for Donald Trump even to turn around quickly. I mean, this is like turning the Titanic, and it's very hard to do it. But we are heading for that iceberg, and it needs to be done. Congress, if it would get its act together, Republicans in Congress could radically make that change in a positive direction and avoid the disaster that is absolutely coming if we don't change course. So one thing I would suggest, too, is the Republican senators need to just tell themselves, listen, we need to change this cloture rule, and they can with a majority vote. And we need to leave cloture to only the most truly important things, and budgets is not one of them. We need to change policy in Washington, D.C. quickly. It's harder to quickly change policy in future Congresses, even if those rules don't change in the next if a Democrat Senate were to come sometime in the future. They need to really get aggressive and pare back government as quickly and as fully as possible so that it becomes very hard to expand it again in the future.
I guess what I'm trying to say is...
Serious issue that has to be addressed now.
I guess what I'm trying to say in part is, if you had members of the Republican Party that are really conservative, right, that want to do what you're talking about, restore the republic, put these policies in executive order into legislation. If we could get out of the, members of the Republican Party that are truly conservative, all of them, whether they like to do it or not, if we could all get them to become cheerleaders for the country, for the restoring of our nation, that means they've got to sell it to the American people. They've got to encourage the American people to let their elected officials know, whether they voted for them or not, what the American people want. Tell them what you want. Call. Melt the phone lines down with your phone calls, or your emails, your letters, whatever. I guess what I'm trying to say is, it seems to me that the Republican Party ought to have more than just a handful of highly recognizable members. They ought to all be out there in that rotunda. When we were on the House side, and then when we were on the Senate side, and the Cannon building, and then on the Senate side, we were in the
Russell
building.
Mm-hmm.
Those rotundas should have been lined up with members of the House and the Senate vying to get on another network and sell, make the case. They should have been lined up. Hey, there's a conservative outlet out there. The word should have gone out. Any of you get down there, there's a conservative outlet that will let you talk. There's another one. There's another one. There's another one. And make the case. But like you said, I think a lot of them are happy with the status quo. I'm not sure how many of them are willing to come on the airwaves and sell freedom and liberty to the American people and make the case for their cause. And I would think all of them should be doing that. That's what Tommy Tuberville did. That's what U.S. Senator Ron Johnson was doing. That's what Glenn Grothman was doing. That's what Chip Roy was doing. MTG was doing. They should all be doing this if they really want to restore the republic. Otherwise, why are they there?
Yeah, and one of the main factors, not the only one, and not exclusive to every member of Congress, is they don't want to lose a $174,000 a year paycheck. They need to get reelected. They've left their careers to do this, and they want it to be a career. And
by what you're saying is, by going on the media, they make the risk of saying something they shouldn't say that ends up being a blunder that goes viral, and they lose their next election.
Yeah, and that can happen. Listen, but what's really interesting about that? Let me say this. One of the things that's really interesting about that is roughly 90% or more of members of Congress, if they go up for election, get reelected. It really, truly is a problem of risk aversion and fear of risk that really doesn't exist. There are a lot of benefits to being a member of Congress, long and short term. Thomas Massey, whom I worked for, always talks about that pin that you see on the lapel of male congressmen. The women will, often wear it as a necklace on their necklace. He started to eventually, after he's up there for a few months, to call it "My Precious." When you walk into these office buildings, you remember you went through the security and all that kind of stuff. Members of Congress don't do that. That security's for the members. It's not for anyone else. So they just walk right around. People give them respect throughout the building, particularly constituents that are walking through.
Oh, yeah. Let me just interrupt right there if I can.
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. I said, Logan, you see that pin? That's a member of Congress. So once he recognized the pin, he was able to say, oh, there's a member of Congress. There's a member of Congress. That guy was a member of Congress. So the pin tells everybody who you are.
That's exactly right. And that causes something in people's minds after a while of having that particular benefit, which is so, in this town at least, which is so superior to the benefits anyone else gets. So it's kind of the massaging the ego issue. So
even when you walk into a restaurant, you probably get a table pretty quick if they see a congressional pin.
Often, yes. And maybe not in every instance, but yeah, often that will happen in this town. So, and that's the whole story behind the Ring of Power in the Lord of the Rings movie that Thomas is alluding to. Gollum wasted away over time because of the benefits that the ring gave him. And it caused him to distort away from being a hobbit into this grotesque creature that you see in the movies and that you read about in the books. And that is the basic problem of human nature. That's what we're dealing with these members of Congress. That's why we need term limits, in my opinion. But that's not the only answer. We really need a reformation of character in this country. Politicians have always been bad in this country. I mean, from our founding, you had grotesque politicians at some level, or at least some of them. It was better after the founding. Everyone was excited and starting something new. But it quickly devolved. But Congress didn't have according to the Constitution, as much authority as they're expressing today, and the executive branch certainly didn't as well. Our gross domestic product, or our percent of gross domestic product of government action in this country was below 10% until we implemented the income tax and the Federal Reserve, where we started expanding so much government and went off the gold standard was the next step. So this has changed dramatically, so now it really does matter, and it really does confer benefits and a sense of authority, and that's hard to extract from someone once they have been imbued in it over time. And this is a basic problem. And by the way, it's up to us as citizens to do something about it by getting involved in elections and changing these people out.
Here is Senator Tommy Tuberville, who we interviewed last week, talking on the Senate floor the last few hours about the plane from Qatar. Listen to this.
The senator from Alabama.
Reserving the right to object. As usual, my Democratic colleagues are losing their mind over the situation. But let's just talk about the facts. First of all, this is not a done deal. It's not happened yet. It's all talk. But if reports are accurate, the government of Qatar is considering gifting the United States Department of Defense an American-made Boeing 747, I'll repeat that, an American-made Boeing 747 plane for temporary use as Air Force One. It is not for the president's personal use, and he will not be using it after he leaves office. It is customary and totally normal for foreign countries to give our government gifts. The DOJ has already said that this does not violate any law. So why are my colleagues and the woke media having a full-blown meltdown over this situation? Perhaps it's because in the past 72 hours, President Trump has delivered so many wins you can't count them all. On Sunday, he negotiated a deal with China, dropping tariffs 50%. On Monday, he secured the release of the last remaining American hostage in Hamas. Aiden Alexander has been through hell the past 584 days, and it took President Trump to bring him home. Today, President Trump just announced hundreds of billions of dollars in new investment from the Middle East, and on Thursday is forcing a face-to-face meeting between Putin and Zelensky to end this brutal war in Ukraine. You'd think the media would be celebrating all these wins along with my colleagues, but as usual, the Trump derangement syndrome is getting in the way. I'm convinced that the media and some of my colleagues would rather President Trump lose on everything and our country lose on everything than be successful. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, we are all Americans. Sometimes I think we forget that. And we should all be able to celebrate any time a president delivers a win for the American taxpayers. And by the way, we are $37 trillion in debt. If another country wants to give us a free plane, saving the taxpayers of this country $400 million, the only thing we should say is thank you. Democrats are rudderless right now. They're looking for something to hang their hat on. They see that President Trump has done more than 4 months and President Biden did in 4 years. So they want to make a plane gift from Qatar the next so-called perfect phone call to my Democratic colleagues instead of wasting our time objecting every time President Trump breathes. Maybe you should get outside of D.C. and go connect with the American people. I can promise you, they don't give a rip about an airplane. They care about their lives and this economy and the things that have been destroyed for the past 4 years that President Trump is trying to put back together. For these reasons, Mr. President, I object.
All right, there you go. Well said.
My friend Jim Banks, Senator Jim Banks, sitting in the chair there, whom I've known since he was a college student at Indiana University. Listen, that statement is absolutely correct. Now, by the way, I understand that there's a little initial odd feeling one's going to get when this gift was suggested, but Senator Tuberville accurately described what the circumstance is. And, you know, it kind of highlights the downfall of the manufacturer of that particular aircraft, who has failed miserably at replacing Air Force One and Air Force Two, as was contracted in the first Trump administration.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
very, very sad situation. One of the great companies in American history is really failing miserably in recent years. It's sad to
Absolutely.
see.
The
But,
world.
listen, this is totally appropriate. It is useful. There's no doubt that Trump saying that the maintenance on the present Air Force One and Air Force Two is out of hand, very expensive. It's got to change.
Washington Report, theconservativecaucus.org is his website. Thanks for watching. Take care. Tonight on the Worldview Report, Texas Governor Greg Abbott suspends the construction of an Islamic residential development that's under fire.